Hello. This set of notes is entitled The Ingredients for Life. What we're going to be looking at here are those particular things that are required in all living organisms for them to be living. It's actually kind of a bit of a biology review, which for a bunch of you I know was a long time ago. And these are the things that are going to be a little bit familiar, hopefully, because it's the essential things that you should have learned, not all of them, but some of those essential things you should have learned in the biology class. So to start this discussion on the ingredients for life, we need to look at those particular chemicals that are required for living things. And again, I've been using this term life, so let's make sure we all have a very good working definition for life. And a life is a series of intricate reactions among chemicals. So a series of intricate reactions among chemicals, that's it. That's life. The next chemical that's really, really important for us to understand with these chemicals of life is water. Very, 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 very important for us in marine biology. Obvious reasons. Water makes up such a huge part of the world. We've talked a lot about it already. But for life, water provides the medium, the place where these particular interactions that we just mentioned can take place. And when we start looking at what are those other compounds that make up a living thing, we often go to organic compounds. And those particular organic compounds that make life possible are the ones that are listed here over my shoulder. You probably are pretty familiar with these: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. No, I'm not cheering for you. I'm trying to help you remember that we use the C, the L, the P, and the N to remember these particular macromolecules, and that's CLAPIT: carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Now for carbohydrates, a few pieces of information that you should know what a carbohydrate is. Glucose is a carbohydrate. That's the chemical formula C6H12O6. Used it quite often in biology. We'll use it a little bit in this class as well. Starches in potatoes and carrots, those longer or polymer molecules that provide that rigid structure in those particular organisms, the potatoes and the carrots. And that's one of the functions of the carbohydrates, is to provide structure. Another one is to provide that short-term chemical energy. Our lipids, similar, they have a relationship with those carbohydrates. Lipids are the fats and the oils. And these particular lipids, their function is the long-term storage of energy. So remember the long-term and the lipids, so the L's, to help you remember that one. And one of the unique characteristics of these lipids is that they repel water, which helps in the production of that cell membrane. The third one is the proteins. These proteins are the major building blocks of life. So all organisms have very specific proteins, and those proteins create the structures that make up the uniqueness of that organism. Proteins are made up of amino acids, and the important thing about amino acids and proteins is that they contain nitrogen. We'll talk a little bit more about nitrogen a little bit later on in the year. There's a huge variety of functions that these particular proteins have as part of that building blocks. They make up enzymes, muscle cells, hormones. Some proteins produce light, some absorb light. Some proteins even act as an antifreeze in the blood or the circulatory fluid of different organisms. And then lastly, we have the nucleic acids. This is our DNA. The Na is for nucleic acid, and our RNA. So our DNA and RNA. The DNA contains the information for making proteins. The RNA is actually making those particular proteins. You might be familiar with the G's, the C's, the A's, and the T's. Those are the nitrogenous bases that make up DNA. And the RNA has G, C, and A, no T. It has a U, that's uracil, instead. Those also made up of nitrogen, another very important chemical we'll talk about a little bit later on. You might be familiar with this term metabolism. I'm not talking about, your metabolism is slowing down as you get older. That's not where we're going exactly. What we're talking about with metabolism is photosynthesis as one part of this overall metabolism. A photosynthesis job is to capture the light energy from the sun and use it to make glucose, sugar, that C6H12O6. So that's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygen atoms. This particular process occurs in the chloroplast. Make sure you have that written down, that photosynthesis happens inside the chloroplast. How this happens? Well, light has to be absorbed, and it's absorbed by a protein, a pigment, called chlorophyll. That's the protein that is absorbing that light. It's not the only one, but it's one of the main ones. And when this light is absorbed, the protein, that chlorophyll, gets all excited, starts shaking around, and it breaks apart water molecules, H2O, into the H's and into the O's. Well, in the presence of CO2, those H's and those O's and those C's can recombine to form that glucose, C6H12O6, and the leftover oxygens combine to form O2, which is the oxygen that we and many other organisms breathe in or absorb, take into their bodies. The organisms that do this photosynthesis process, these guys are called autotrophs, or self-feeders. Things like bacteria, algae, of course plants, we'll talk about those, and there's some other single-celled organisms that we'll discuss in this particular unit that do this photosynthesis process. The second part of this metabolism is cellular respiration. And the job of this cellular respiration process is to take that glucose and turn it into ATP, the energy molecule. Cellular respiration is the capture, the storage, and the use of that food, sugar, to make ATP, that energy. And this ATP, the full name is adenosine triphosphate, but let's just use ATP for short. The important part there is that TP, the triphosphates. There are 3 what scientists call phosphate groups. That's phosphorus and oxygen combined together to make these groups. So there's 3 of those particular groups in this ATP. Well, the energy is in the bonds that hold one phosphate group to another phosphate group. So the bonds that form to hold those, that's where the energy is. And that's where we have this particular diagram here. Here is the ATP, adenosine, and the 3 phosphates. The energy is in those particular bonds. When those bonds break, energy is released, and the cell can utilize that energy to form bonds with other particular molecules. To get the energy to make this ATP, that's where the sugar comes in, C6H12O6. That's a lot of bonds right there, but it's also a big, bulky molecule. It doesn't stack very well like this one. So if the cell gets this sugar, breaks it apart, releases the energy in the bonds of the C's, the H's, and the O's, and uses those to make these nice, neat, stacking ATPs, it has this energy available to be used later on. This process of cellular respiration, going from that sugar to this ATP, happens in the mitochondria, the mighty mitochondria. There's a picture of one right here. It looks a little bit like a kidney bean. And there's actually 2 parts to this particular process that we should be relatively familiar with. The first one is this aerobic respiration, and again, this goes back to those days in biology. And with aerobic respiration, here's what I want you to know in here, is that it uses oxygen in aerobic respiration to make 36 molecules of ATP. So oxygen and sugar in the mighty mitochondria, 36 molecules of ATP. And then there's anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration does not use oxygen. And when it does its particular process, it's actually not happening in the mitochondria. Anaerobic respiration happens in the cytosol, the space inside the cell. Does not use oxygen, and it makes 2 molecules of ATP. Not very much, but there are some organisms that rely on this only, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. Heterotrophs, those organisms that eat other things, do only cellular respiration. Autotrophs do photosynthesis and cellular respirations. It's important to remember that those autotrophs do both of those They make the sugar, but they still need to use that sugar to make that ATP energy. Speaking of those autotrophs and heterotrophs, cells extraordinarily important. They are the basic unit of life. A single cell contains all the molecules needed for life to occur and all the processes that need to happen for life to occur. All cells are wrapped in a cell membrane. You can see here in blue and in that red. And the cell membrane's job is to regulate or control what chemicals move in and out of the cell. It limits those particular things. There's two basic types of cells, prokaryote cells being the simplest. Prokaryote cells are unique. There's this guy over here because they have no nucleus. They have no membrane-bound organelles. They still have DNA. They still need to make proteins, so they have a ribosome, which isn't a membrane-bound organelle. Of course, they have the cell membrane. All prokaryotes are only single cell. That's it. They do not make any multicelled organisms. The best example of a prokaryote is bacteria. And then the second type of cell is a eukaryote. That's this guy down here. You are familiar with a eukaryote because you are a eukaryote. Hopefully you will get that in your head. These are much more complex. And they're complex because they do have a nucleus. They do have membrane-bound organelles. They can be single-celled, or they can make up multi-celled organisms like, I don't know, you, or a whale, or perhaps a sea anemone, or, I don't know, maybe a flatworm. Lots and lots and lots and lots of different varieties of multi-celled organisms. All of them are eukaryotes. Now, I mentioned that they have those membrane-bound organelles. There's a couple of them that I would like you to reflect back on and know a little bit better. The nucleus, that contains the DNA, controls the production of proteins. Ribosomes make the proteins. The endoplasmic reticulum, or the ER for short, transports those proteins around the cell. The Golgi apparatus packages, labels, and ships those proteins out of the cell through a process called exocytosis. So exiting the cell, exocytosis. The, of course, mighty mitochondria, which we just mentioned, is responsible for producing that ATP energy, and the chloroplast, which is responsible for creating sugars from that sunlight, carbon dioxide, and a little bit of water. Those are our cells. The levels of organization, once we have these cells, is as follows. Those single-celled organisms, the simple ones, the bacteria, one cell, it does everything. Every part of life involved there, it is doing. Well, the multi-celled organisms, they have a division of labor. We start that division of labor way back, small stuff, that's the atoms. And then atoms, a whole bunch of them put together form molecules. Bunch of molecules put together form organelles. A whole bunch of organelles put together form a cell. Bunch of cells put together are forming tissues. A bunch of those tissues formed together form an organ. A bunch of those organs form a organ system. A bunch of those organ systems that are put together are going to form an organism. And a bunch of organisms put together are going to form a population. A bunch of populations, different organisms put together form a community. A bunch of communities form an ecosystem. When you have a whole bunch of ecosystems, you have the biosphere, the planet Earth. So a couple things that I would like you to make sure you know on tissues. Once we have a bunch of cells all put together forming tissues, they're specialized coordinated groups of cells. A muscle tissue, nerve tissue. Organs. These are organized tissues that do a special function. So your liver, that particular organ has a very special function. The organ systems. We have a whole bunch of particular organs all working together. Your heart, blood vessels. They're working together as part of the circulatory system. Organisms, of course, that's an entire individual. A population, a group of organisms of the same kind, that is, the same species. Community, when you have a bunch of different populations, different species of organisms, all living together. And then, of course, the ecosystem is where we get different communities together, and we also incorporate the physical, non-living environment within those ecosystems. So in the marine environment, we have various areas. Near shore, we have at the ocean bottom, we have at the ocean surface, we have rocky coastlines, we have sandy beaches, lots of different ecosystems, but all of them incorporating that non-living environment. And that's the end of these notes. We will be going over the essential questions in our next class period.